From the snow-capped peaks of the Andes, where the air grows so thin that even breathing feels like a struggle, a small, humble leaf has stood as a symbol of survival and the sacred for thousands of years. The coca leaf. To the Inca, it was far more than a plant. It was a divine gift from the sun, God himself, bestowed upon humankind to endure hunger, sickness, and the harsh trials of nature. Yet behind the gentle green of those leaves lies a tangled story, one where faith, power, and human ambition slowly transform the sacred into a global addiction. Tonight, you and I will journey back through time, to the ancient villages that cling to the mountain slopes, where the wind of the Andes still whispers through forgotten rituals, and where we'll uncover the secrets of a leaf once known as the breath of the gods. So, close your eyes, and let this story carry you into a forgotten chapter of history, to the very place where the tale of cocaine began, rooted in humanity's most sacred belief. To understand why the coca leaf holds such sacred meaning, we must return to the world of the ancient Inca, a civilization that lived by the mountains, the wind, and the sun. In a land where every breath was a battle against altitude and cold, the coca leaf appeared as a natural miracle, helping them endure hunger, ease fatigue, and keep their spirits strong through long hours of climbing. The Inca believed coca was the breath of Inti, the sun god, giver of light and life to all beings. They called the leaf by a name filled with reverence: Mama Coca, Mother Coca. It was no coincidence that in every ceremony, every sacred offering, coca appeared as a bridge between humankind and the divine. When priests burned the leaves, they believed the rising smoke carried their prayers to the heavens. In Incan society, coca was not for everyone. It was a privilege reserved for nobles, priests, and warriors, those considered closest to the gods. Commoners were allowed to chew coca only when working on state projects, as a sacred reward that helped them endure hunger and exhaustion. Chewing coca was not a mere habit. It was a spiritual act, a ritual of harmony between humans, nature, and the divine. When the first rays of sunlight touched the Andes peaks, the Inca would take 3 coca leaves, symbols of the 3 realms, the earthly world, the heavens, and the underworld, and offer them to the sun. In that moment, they whispered their prayer: Mama Coca, bless us. It was a simple invocation, yet it embodied the purest faith humankind could offer to nature. What made coca extraordinary was its power to soothe hunger and fatigue, enabling people to labor tirelessly in harsh conditions. When mixed with a pinch of alkaline ash, the leaf released a surge of energy through the body. Yet beyond the physical, coca nourished the spirit and sustained faith. To the Inca, it was the sacred thread binding them to the gods, the soul of the mountains, reachable only by those with true belief. From the temples of Machu Picchu to small villages clinging to the cliffs, coca was everywhere, in the pockets of farmers, in weddings and funerals, and in the long pilgrimages across the Andes. To them, without coca, life itself would not survive in the sacred land, and so, when the Spaniards arrived in the 16th century, they saw more than gold and silver. They saw an invisible power hidden within those tiny green leaves. At first, the missionaries condemned coca as heresy, a tool of devil worship. But soon they realized the miners could not work without it. The very leaf they sought to ban became the means to exploit, a way to drive thousands of slaves in the silver mines of Potosi. Thus, the sacred was reduced to a commodity. Faith was replaced by profit. The same leaves once offered to the gods now fueled the great machinery of Spanish colonial greed. Yet deep in the hearts of the native people, coca remained coca, still the mother, still the guardian spirit of the mountains and ancestors. Despite bans, control, and exploitation, they secretly kept small pouches of coca close to their hearts, as if preserving the very soul of their people. It was a quiet form of resistance, not fought with weapons, but sustained by faith. And that faith allowed coca to endure through the centuries. When the Incan Empire fell, when priests were slain and temples destroyed, coca survived in every breath of the Andes people, in every handful of leaves they tucked into their clothing before climbing the mountains. Viewed through the lens of culture, coca stands as a testament to humanity's sacred bond with nature. The Inca did not merely use coca, they worshipped it, believing it to possess a living spirit. In their legend, Coca was born from the heart of a betrayed woman, transformed by the gods so that humankind would never forget the comfort and strength born from love. Thus, when they chewed the leaf, they believed they were sharing in sorrow and receiving Mother Nature's forgiveness. Today, when the world remembers only cocaine, the white powder that has destroyed countless lives, we forget that its origin was once pure. The original coca leaf was never a sin. It was part of human faith. It stands as proof that in history, the sacred can always be corrupted when power and ambition outweigh reverence for nature. And perhaps that is what makes the story of Coca so tragically beautiful. A leaf that once saved the hungry, soothed the weary, and connected humankind with the divine, was turned into a symbol of addiction, violence, and greed. Yet if you listen closely, amid the cold wind sweeping through the Andes, you can still hear the faint whisper of Mama Coca. She still exists, still protects her children, still reminds the world that all things begin in innocence, and it is only the human heart that changes them. The story of Coca, then, is not just about a plant. It is a reflection of humanity's own journey, from purity to corruption, from worship to exploitation. And tonight, as you listen, let your mind drift to those distant mountain slopes. Picture the golden sunlight spilling across the weathered hands of the Inca as they lift the small green leaves and whisper their prayer. For there, in the fragile space between faith and ambition, the story of cocaine began, and so too did the story of us. But like every glorious civilization in history, the light of the Inca Empire gradually dimmed beneath the shadow of foreign sails. From across the ocean came men bearing the cross and the sword, heralds of the Spanish conquest, marking the dawn of a colonial age in which the Incas' sacred faith was shattered, and the coca leaf, once the sun god's divine gift, began a dark and unending journey. To the Inca, coca had symbolized life, spirit, and devotion, but to the Spaniards, it was nothing more than a tool and a source of profit. When they saw the natives chewing coca to ease their fatigue, they felt no reverence, only calculation, productivity, endurance, and silver. And within that cold gaze, an entire sacred culture was stripped bare and seized. At first, Jesuit priests condemned coca as the devil's leaf, unable to fathom why these people could worship something so simple. They burned the coca pouches, forbade its use, and decreed that only those who converted to Christianity might live. But soon they discovered a grim truth. Without coca, the enslaved miners could not endure the brutal work inside the silver mines of Potosi, the mountain of silver that poured untold wealth into the coffers of Spain. And so, what was once forbidden became restored. Not in the light of faith, but under the shadow of exploitation. The colonial masters understood that coca could turn men into tireless machines. They allowed the natives to chew the leaves during labor, distributing them as the empire's own painkiller. Each small leaf became an invisible shackle, binding human souls deep within the suffocating mines where sunlight never reached. The Spaniards no longer needed whips. They needed only a steady supply of coca. The conquered labored willingly, for the leaf was now the only thing keeping them alive. With every weary breath, they still felt the faint, bittersweet taste of Mother Coca, the lingering memory of home, ancestors, and freedom lost. Thus, Mama Coca, the mother goddess of the mountains, was dethroned, exploited, and transformed into an instrument of control. The pouches once offered to the heavens were now rationed like currency in labor camps. The sacred had become transactional. Faith had become a commodity. The Spaniards quickly realized that coca's value extended far beyond keeping miners alive. It could also make them rich. They harvested it, packed it, and transported it across their colonies. It became part of the colonial economy, taxed, regulated, and drained of meaning. In records from that era, Spanish officials described coca as a gift from God for governance. But in truth, it was their way of sanctifying exploitation, using the very culture of the conquered to sustain their rule. And yet, the Andean people, though forced to submit, continued to preserve coca's sacred essence in secret rituals. They offered the leaves to Inti at dawn, their trembling hands hiding the act from watchful eyes, whispering prayers for Mother Coca's forgiveness, for having been used in the service of darkness. They believed that one day Mama Coca would awaken and reclaim her spirit from the hands of the invaders. But reality was far crueler. As silver flowed from Potosi to Europe, enriching Madrid, Seville, and Rome, millions of native lives were spent and forgotten. Beneath the glitter of silver dust lay bodies stilled by exhaustion, lips still stained with coca leaves, the final trace of a faith betrayed. During the colonial era, coca became the clearest proof of how humanity can corrupt the sacred in pursuit of power. The Spaniards conquered not only land, but spirit. And in that conquest, coca was their first victim, forced to abandon its divinity to serve human greed. From a historical lens, it stands as one of civilization's most tragic turns, the fall of a spiritual symbol into mere merchandise. The story of coca, therefore, is not just about a plant, but about the moral decay of humankind itself. The native farmers, once content to live peacefully along the mountain slopes, were now compelled to cultivate coca for their conquerors. Each harvest season, they looked up at the sky and softly called Mama Coca's name as though to apologize, for they knew that what had once sustained their ancestors was now fueling the oppression of their people. And yet, amidst the tragedy, something remarkable endured. Coca survived. It did not die with the Inca Empire, nor vanish under the swords of Cortez or Pizarro. Exploited, abused, and buried in the mines. Still it grew, green and defiant, on the rugged slopes, like the spirit of the Andes themselves, resilient, unyielding, and unconquered. That endurance made coca a bridge between two worlds, one of wounded faith, the other of endless greed. And at that intersection, the story of humanity continued, written in blood, sweat, and tears. Imagine, for a moment, a dark night in the 16th century. The sound of hammers echo deep underground. A young miner kneels, clutching a few coca leaves. He chews slowly, the bitterness spreading across his tongue. The taste of the earth, of freedom, of fading faith. In that moment, he knows he has only one thing left, his belief in Mother Coca, even as others have turned her into a tool of enslavement. The story of Spanish colonialism, then, is not only one of power and conquest, it is an indictment of greed and pride. They conquered an empire, but lost what the Inca possessed, reverence for nature and for the soul of the earth itself. The coca leaf, once a symbol of faith, became a symbol of sin. Yet even in its distorted form, it carried the seed of memory, reminding us that everything mankind takes by force will one day return to nature. And so, through the long night of history, even as the Inca's light was extinguished, coca continued to burn softly, the flame of memory flickering through the centuries. That flame would be rekindled once more when the Western world, driven by science and ambition, rediscovered the hidden power within those tiny green leaves. It was then that history turned its page. The moment humanity learned to extract coca's essence, to refine it into cocaine, transforming a sacred belief into a global addiction, and ushering in the age of miracle medicine and of tragedy. In the centuries that followed, the shadows of colonial rule slowly faded, but the legacy they left behind lingered, a scar etched deep into the soul of South America. Coca endured, still planted, still chewed, still woven into the daily life of the Andes. Though scorned and branded as the leaf of savages, it survived, patiently awaiting a destined moment, the day when the Western world, armed with ambition and intellect, would once again reach for this sacred leaf. But this time, not through faith, through science. The 19th century, the age of enlightenment, of discovery, of faith in human reason. People began to believe that every secret of nature could be unlocked with a test tube and a microscope. Amid the fervor of the Industrial Revolution and the pride of science, the coca leaf, an ancient emblem of the Inca, suddenly became the object of passionate experimentation. In 1860, a German chemist named Albert Niemann successfully extracted a pure alkaloid from coca leaves. He called it cocaine. When the first glittering white crystals appeared beneath the laboratory light, he had no idea that he had just opened a new chapter in human history, one of admiration, desire, and ruin. Cocaine was hailed as a chemical miracle. European doctors rushed to study it, test it, and praise it as nature's divine gift. It dulled pain, sharpened the mind, boosted energy, and most astonishingly, induced a powerful sense of euphoria unlike anything known before. At a time when medicine still fumbled with morphine, chloroform, and ether, cocaine gleamed like the dawn of a new era. Then, in 1863, an Italian pharmacist named Angelo Mariani transformed that discovery into the first commercial product, Vin Mariani, a wine infused with coca extract. The drink became an instant sensation across Europe. From nobles to artists, everyone praised it as a beverage that brightens the mind and soothes the soul. Pope Leo XIII even awarded Mariani a Medal of Honor, declaring that he had brought strength to the weary spirit of mankind. Vin Mariani became the symbol of an industrial age that believed happiness could be manufactured by blending nature with science. Colourful posters adorned European cities, smiling women raising glasses beneath the slogan, "Power from the Andes." But the intoxication didn't stop there. In 1886, an American pharmacist named John Pemberton, a veteran of the Civil War, sought to create a new tonic drink, also made with coca extract. He named it Coca-Cola. Initially sold in pharmacies as a health elixir, it was advertised as a remedy to relieve fatigue, sharpen the mind, and uplift the spirit. No one could have imagined that this dark liquid would become one of the most iconic commercial products in history, and, at the same time, a direct descendant of a once sacred leaf. Coca, once the heart of Incan ritual, had now become a mass-market refreshment. The world was falling in love with a new kind of energy called cocaine, blind to the fact that the line between miracle and menace was quietly fading away. That faith was further strengthened by the greatest minds of the era. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, wrote essays praising cocaine as a magical drug against depression and exhaustion. He believed it could free the human mind, erasing fear and anxiety. To Freud, cocaine was the key to liberation. He even encouraged friends and patients to use it, including Dr. Ernst von Fleischl, who would later die of severe cocaine addiction. From there, cocaine was no longer just a medicine. It became a symbol of progress and civilization. Pharmaceutical companies rushed to include it in their products. Nasal drops, painkillers, even lozenges for children. Advertisements promised miracles, bringing vitality, joy, and confidence. Yet beneath the golden sheen of science and commerce, darkness began to rise. Doctors started reporting strange symptoms: hallucinations, insomnia, paranoia, and violent behavior among long-term users. The initial euphoria gave way to dependence and despair. Cocaine, the miracle drug, had revealed its true face. It not only healed, it created a new disease. Freud, who had once praised cocaine fervently, fell silent after his closest friend died from addiction. He realized that the illumination of the spirit he had sought was, in truth, a consuming flame wrapped in the disguise of science. The 19th century closed in paradox. Humanity had reached unprecedented heights of knowledge, yet sank deeper into addiction to its own creations. Cocaine, once the pride of modern science, had already sown the first seeds of the coming century's tragedy. If, in Incan times, coca had connected humankind to the divine, then in the 19th century, cocaine was the rope with which humankind bound its own soul. It stood as the emblem of human arrogance, the belief that we could seize the power of nature without paying a price. The commercialization of cocaine marked a turning point, from sacred leaf to global commodity, from symbol of spirit to instrument of consumption. And once faith was replaced by profit, all things sacred lost their meaning. Picture Paris at the close of the 19th century, glittering soirees, writers and musicians and nobles sipping Vin Mariani from crystal glasses. They spoke of art, philosophy, and the radiant future of mankind, never realizing that what they toasted was the beginning of a worldwide nightmare. Across the ocean, Coca-Cola gradually altered its formula to suit the masses, reducing its cocaine content and removing it entirely by the early 20th century. But the trace of that leaf remained, hidden in the name, in the symbol, in a history that could never be erased. The story of the 19th century is proof that every time humanity touches the sacred with a hand of ambition, it leaves behind a wound. From the Incas' Mama Coca to Neiman's laboratory, to Mariani's wine glass, to Pemberton's bottle of Coca-Cola, every journey began in reverence and ended in possession, and, as destiny would have it, when the light of the miracle drug burned brightest, The shadows were already gathering. A new century was dawning, one in which the pride of science would crumble. Cocaine would turn from marvel to menace, transforming users from patients into criminals, and dragging humanity into a spiral with no escape. Because, as in all tales of power misused, the price always comes. It is only a matter of time. The 19th century drew to a close in the radiant glow of dazzling inventions. Yet beneath that brilliance, a silent storm was forming. Cocaine, science's beloved child, the pride of modern medicine, had begun to show its cracks. As humanity stepped across the threshold of the 20th century, the world awoke to a painful truth. The so-called elixir of happiness was, in fact, the seed of suffering. And as with every miracle that's been abused, collapse was inevitable. The fall of the miracle drug cocaine, once celebrated as the symbol of energy, intellect, and transcendence, had become a haunting specter over the world. From the pristine laboratories of Europe to the slums of America, from the desks of physicians to the street corners of drifters, the white powder revealed its true form, a thief of the human soul. In the early decades of the 20th century, hospitals and asylums began to report strange cases. Cocaine users trapped in cycles of hallucination, insomnia, paranoia, and violence. The bursts of euphoria quickly turned into exhaustion. Dreams dissolved into nightmares. Doctors, artists, and soldiers, those who once called themselves the enlightened, fell one by one to the very substance they had once praised. The press of the era called cocaine the devil's drug. Newspapers ran exposés about New York's shadowed streets, where addicts wandered with trembling hands and hollow eyes. Stories spread of people who, after only a few doses, lost their reason, their humanity, consumed by an unquenchable hunger. In 1912, the US Public Health Service released its first official report on the dangers of cocaine, recording hundreds of deaths from overdose and poisoning. Alarm spread quickly. Once hailed as a wonder cure, cocaine was now a national threat. By 1914, the United States passed the Harrison Narcotics Act, restricting its manufacture and distribution, the first major step in dismantling the miracle drug once worshipped around the world. But the most terrifying shift was not in law. It was in perception. If the 19th century had glorified cocaine as a symbol of progress, then the early 20th century turned it into an emblem of sin and punishment. What a cruel reversal. From being cherished in the laboratory, cocaine was cast down into the alleyways, a refuge for those running from themselves. Among scientists, shame replaced pride. Albert Niemann had died young, never witnessing the tragedy born of his discovery. Freud, once cocaine's most passionate defender, spent his final years in guilt and silence. He never spoke of the miracle drug again. The fall of cocaine mirrored the disillusionment of an entire era. It exposed the dark side of blind faith in science, the realization that not every discovery leads to light. The world began to understand that when humanity tries to seize nature's power, the price is never small. Meanwhile, in South America, where the Coca forests still cloaked the Andean slopes, the indigenous people watched as the Western world unraveled under the weight of its own creation. They knew the fault did not lie in the leaf, but in human ambition. To them, Coca remained sacred, the sun god's gift, though they now saw a world that no longer knew how to honor it. And yet, even condemned, cocaine did not disappear. It merely changed its shape, from clinic to black market, from medicine to contraband, from symbol of civilization to emblem of crime. The more it was forbidden, the more alluring it became. Humanity's addiction was not only to the white powder, but to the illusion of power, the thrill of crossing limits. By the early 20th century, smuggling networks had begun to rise, carrying cocaine across oceans. Hidden routes from South America crept into Europe and North America. What had once been a scientific discovery evolved into a global criminal empire, something no law could erase. This story exposes a deep paradox. That which begins with the desire to heal can end in destruction. Cocaine was born from the dream of curing pain, yet it went on to shatter millions of lives. During the 1920s and 1930s, the era of jazz and bootleg liquor, cocaine lingered like a dangerous secret. Artists, musicians, and poets sought it out to awaken inspiration, as if trying to grasp the faint afterglow of a vanished golden age. But that light was only the dying ember of a torch long extinguished. Then came the decades of war, and cocaine was replaced by newer, cheaper, stronger drugs, heroin, amphetamines. Yet even as it faded from the spotlight, it never truly vanished. It lingered like a ghost of the past, whispering that every great invention carries within it the seed of tragedy. Looking back, the fall of the miracle drug was more than the downfall of a chemical compound. It was the collapse of humanity's blind faith in its own power. The 19th century believed knowledge could redeem the world. The 20th learned that knowledge itself has no morality, only people do. And when knowledge is used without humility, it turns against its creator. It is bitter to realize that the journey of cocaine mirrors the journey of humankind itself. Born of curiosity, rising to arrogance and ending in remorse. The coca leaf, once a symbol of harmony between man and the divine, was torn from its sacred essence and turned into a commodity. And once the sacred becomes a product, its fall is inevitable. Yet within that downfall flickered a small light, the light of awareness. As the world began to understand cocaine's devastation, movements for education, regulation, and reform emerged. Scientists of a new generation no longer idolized invention. They learned to respect the boundaries of nature. The collapse of cocaine forced humanity to look inward. What drives us to chase sensations so desperately that we would trade our souls for fleeting euphoria? Perhaps cocaine itself was never the true danger, but rather the emptiness within the modern spirit, the loneliness, pressure, and craving for control that lead us to seek escape in illusion. When the last glow of the miracle drug finally faded, only one truth remained. Every human-made power has its limits, and sometimes the light we chase is nothing more than the reflection of our own darkness. It took the world nearly half a century to awaken from the dream called cocaine. Yet even in its fall, the story endures. A solemn reminder that every time humankind proudly declares it has conquered nature, nature simply smiles and quietly takes back what was always hers. And so, from the ashes of a miracle drug, humanity began a new journey, one of reckoning, redemption, and the slow healing of wounds it had inflicted upon itself. But the question lingers still. Have we truly learned? Or are we merely walking the same path again, only under a different name for our next miracle? As the wave of condemnation against the miracle drug spread, the world believed that cocaine had been forever buried in the shadows of the past. But ironically, that darkness was only a temporary curtain, hiding the glittering stage of its rebirth. Like a restless spirit that refused to rest, cocaine returned, no longer draped in the robes of medicine or science, but in a new guise, the emblem of luxury, seduction, and power. From the ashes of the divine drug, a new era was ignited, the age of neon lights, endless parties, and the dazzling illusion of freedom known as the 1920s, 1950s. Cocaine in the Age of Glamor, 1920s, 1950s, the 1920s. The world had just emerged from war. After years of fear and death, people yearned to forget. They turned to jazz, to the stage lights, to sensations that made them feel alive again. The 20th century opened with a promise, a new world, where every old limit was meant to be broken. In Paris, New York, Berlin, Hollywood, smoke-filled bars pulsed with laughter and swing rhythms, the heartbeat of a reckless age. And within that hedonistic air, cocaine quietly returned, as a familiar guest of decadence. If the 19th century had worshipped cocaine for its power to heal, this new age adored it for its power to erase fatigue, to erase war, to erase the harshness of reality itself. For the elite and the artists, cocaine was the talisman of creativity and freedom. They believed that with a single breath, a single shimmering line, emotions would erupt and boundaries would dissolve. In the cramped rooms of Montparnasse or the secret gatherings of Manhattan, white powder floated like stardust and laughter echoed into the night, as if the world had never known sorrow. The glamorous era, the Roaring Twenties, was a moment when humanity lived at a mad velocity, and once again, cocaine became the fuel of impulsive brilliance. It was the invisible current powering actors, dancers, writers, painters. In Hollywood, silver screen stars like Clara Bow, Tallulah Bankhead, or Judy Garland were rumored to use cocaine to stay radiant on stage. In Europe, Modernist artists and surrealist poets called it a gateway to the subconscious, a bridge between reason and instinct. Cocaine stepped fully onto the stage, no longer hiding in laboratories. It glittered in bars, nightclubs, backstage rooms, and on the lips of stars. And curiously, in this era, cocaine was no longer seen as the devil's drug. Instead, it was wrapped in the beauty of taboo. The more forbidden it became, the more seductive it was, a secret accessible only to the elite. By the 1930s, the world was drowning in economic despair, yet the powerful continued to feast on illusion. Cocaine became the mask of confidence, helping them forget the red numbers and the fear of collapse. While millions faced hunger and unemployment, the upper class still sparkled at midnight galas, where white powder swirled in glasses of champagne, a symbol of a society drifting further from reality. Then came the 1940s and 1950s, the golden age of Hollywood. Film stars, with flawless faces and radiant smiles, became icons of the American dream. But behind the glamour lay an underworld ruled by cocaine. Studios demanded perfection, forcing actors to remain bright, tireless, beautiful. Cocaine, fast, potent, discreet, became the divine energy of Hollywood. But that energy, like every artificial light, burned too brightly and too briefly. Ironically, cocaine of this era wore a mask of elegance. It was tied to tuxedos and silk gowns, champagne and Cadillacs. No one remembered the countless lives it had destroyed only decades earlier. Once again, society fell into the same trap, idolizing what it had once cursed. Cocaine became a new badge of power, the mark of the successful, the creative, the ones who know how to live. And so, the world forgot that behind the dazzling lights were souls quietly cracking apart. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald spoke of the American dream, a dream of wealth, freedom and fame. But had he lived longer, perhaps he would have realized that dream had been dusted with white powder. Cocaine was more than a stimulant. It was a metaphor for the age itself, fast, brilliant and utterly hollow. In music, in art, in cinema, cocaine flowed like an invisible current. It helped artists push through fatigue, helped musicians play through the night, helped writers write without end. But it also blurred the line between inspiration and delusion, between freedom and dependence. Many shone brightly only to fade alone. Artists, consumed by the very fire they thought they controlled. Cocaine in this era was no longer the drug of the devil. It was the beautiful dream that society sang itself to sleep with. Everyone knew it was dangerous, yet everyone believed they were strong enough to master it. And that was the grandest illusion of all. After World War II, the world began to shift. The thirst for freedom morphed into consumerism, yet cocaine remained, quietly waiting. In the shadows of luxurious apartments, it still passed from hand to hand. A whisper reminding humanity that its hunger for power and pleasure never truly dies. Looking back, the 1920s, 1950s gleam like a masterpiece painted in golden ash. On the surface, an era of art, innovation and progress, but beneath it, a collective loneliness, a generation fleeing the memories of war by plunging into endless intoxication. Cocaine was only the mirror, reflecting the human soul of that time, radiant, fragile, and desperate to forget. As the 1950s came to an end, cocaine once again retreated backstage. But it never disappeared. It simply waited for a new generation with new hungers to summon it back. And far away, across the borders of South America, deep within the forests where coca leaves still grew green, a new power was stirring. The birth of the first cartels was as if history itself was preparing for yet another resurrection. From Hollywood's glow to the blood-soaked streets of Medellin. Because cocaine, no matter how many times the world tries to destroy it, always finds a way to return, seductive, dangerous, and never truly dead. When the lights of lavish parties began to fade, and the jazz melodies of the 1950s lingered only as a distant, nostalgic echo, the world slowly realized that behind that glitter lay a deep shadow, the shadow of an invisible power, a power that did not belong to kings or governments, but was born from tiny grains of white powder, capable of reshaping the course of human history. And as America and Europe tightened their grip on control, a new wave quietly rose in the south, in the misty heights of the Andes, where the coca leaf was born, and where the modern drug empire began writing its bloodiest chapter. This was the era of the South American cartels, underground empires built on blood, money, and fear. The 1970s, the world had just stumbled out of the intoxication of freedom. The Cold War divided the great powers, and in the void between them, the impoverished lands of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia discovered their own kind of gold, white gold. Cocaine, once dismissed as the residue of a decadent past, was reborn, not in the hands of doctors or aristocrats, but in the fists of men willing to kill to protect their profits. They were not just traders, they were empire builders, and in their eyes, nothing was holier than power itself. Colombia, once known for coffee and emerald green mountains, suddenly became the beating heart of the global underworld. From the hidden valleys of Medellin to the dense jungles of Cali, small groups of farmers who once grew coca simply to survive found themselves at the center of an economic storm. When demand surged from the United States, where the upper class and celebrities rediscovered cocaine as the fashionable high, rivers of profit flowed southward. Those small groups transformed into crime lords, and from their ranks emerged a name that would echo through history: Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine, a man who built the largest criminal empire on earth, controlling nearly 80% of the world's cocaine supply. Escobar was not just a criminal. He was a monarch in his own kingdom. He built churches, funded the poor, bribed politicians, and controlled every vein of black money pulsing across borders. To the people of Medellin, he was a Robin Hood. To the rest of the world, he was the face of death itself. As his empire expanded, rival powers, like the Cali cartel, rose beside him, equally cunning and ruthless. These cartels were not mere smugglers. They bought police, manipulated governments, and infiltrated politics at its highest levels. But the story of the cartels was not only one of blood and wealth. It was also a story of despair. It was the story of those left behind. In lands gripped by poverty, injustice, and weak governance, the coca leaf became the only escape. A single coca plant earned a farmer 10 times more than corn or coffee ever could. So when armed men arrived, promising money and purpose, few had the power to refuse. Slowly, villages turned into plantations, plantations into territories, and territories into nations within nations. The North looked down upon the South with horror. The United States, once the greatest consumer of cocaine's euphoria, now found itself the greatest victim of its own addiction. The government launched the war on drugs, pouring billions into anti-narcotic operations, sending advisors, weapons, even troops to South America. But the harder they fought, the more sophisticated the cartels became. They dug tunnels, bought airplanes, and built networks that reached deep into politics itself. Every brick in their empire was laid with blood. Journalists, judges, politicians, anyone who stood in their way was silenced without mercy. The streets of Medellin thundered with bombs and gunfire, while rivers of dirty money flowed into the banks of America and Europe. Cocaine was no longer just a product, it was a global instrument of power. Yet the most terrifying thing was not the violence or the wealth, it was the world's indifference. In cities far away, millions inhaled thin white lines at parties, unaware that across the ocean, children held rifles, villages burned, and mothers wept over their sons' bodies, all for that same white powder. Cocaine had become the ultimate paradox, a symbol of luxury and destruction, of two worlds intertwined, one indulging, the other perishing. And yet, amid that madness, a faint awakening began. Journalists exposed the truth, films captured the horror. And those who had lived through it, police, reporters, civilians, began to speak. They told the story of a Colombia torn apart by violence, but also of a people brave enough to stand against fear. The rise of the South American cartels stands as one of the darkest chapters of modern history, a place where greed met poverty, where the civilized world and the criminal world merged upon the same river of cocaine. It was a mirror reflecting the shadow of globalization, where the boundaries between morality and profit dissolved into grey. And when the gunfire finally subsided, one haunting question remained behind the smoke. Had we truly won the war on drugs, or was it all just another cycle, where power, money, and guilt endlessly intertwine, just as they had since the sacred birth of the coca leaf in the myths of the Andes. Here, the story does not end. It merely transforms into a new age, where cocaine is no longer just a South American affliction, but a global fever. And the world, though scarred and bloodstained, still seems unable to learn its final lesson. And as the gunsmoke of the 1970s had yet to fade, while the South American cartels still ruled in silence, a new storm began to form in the north, in the very heart of the modern world. It did not rise from battlefields, but from high-rise apartments, from glittering nightclubs, and from parties that never seemed to end. The 1980s, America entered the age of neon lights, of MTV, of the dream of wealth and the fever of extreme consumerism. And in that whirlwind, the small white powder from South America suddenly became a symbol of status, power, and ultimately, destruction. People called it the American cocaine craze, a grand and tragic chapter, both dazzling and dark, in the history of modern pop culture. Cocaine in the 1980s no longer bore the face of sin. It wore the mask of sophistication, the drug of the successful. On Wall Street, investors snorted lines in boardrooms, believing it sharpened their focus and creativity. In the world of entertainment, actors, singers, and models all saw cocaine as an essential part of their glamorous lifestyle. The white dust did not just creep into their lungs, it seeped into the very heart of American society, where everyone was chasing the golden dream. America at that time was a nation of contradictions. On one hand, it was an era of booming technology, cinema, music, and wealth. Yet on the other, that very prosperity created a vast spiritual emptiness, a void people tried to fill with artificial doses of happiness. Cocaine, with its instant euphoria, became the key that unlocked a counterfeit heaven everyone wanted to taste. From Los Angeles to New York, from Miami to Chicago, smuggling routes exploded in unprecedented scale. The South American cartels, especially Medellin, had found their true gold mine. Every month, tons of cocaine poured into the US through the Mexican border, the Caribbean Sea, and even commercial flights. The immense profits fueled a criminal underworld that grew at breathtaking speed. Dirty money was laundered through restaurants, nightclubs, and even legitimate banks. Miami became the epicenter of the storm, a city radiant by day and deadly by night. The press dubbed it the cocaine capital of the world. Alongside the neon lights came gunfire, explosions, and bodies collapsing in the streets. The cartels no longer hid in shadows. They waged open wars for territory right on American soil. Violence escalated, police were bribed, and fear spread across the nation. Yet the most striking part was how American society reacted. As long as cocaine stayed in the hands of the wealthy, it was seen as a luxury stimulant, a mark of success and style. But when it trickled down to the working class and morphed into crack cocaine, cheaper, deadlier, and devastatingly addictive, the tone shifted overnight. The Reagan administration declared the war on drugs, the second great crusade against narcotics. But this war targeted not just drugs, it targeted the poor, the marginalized neighborhoods, the communities of color, where crack spread like wildfire. Those years revealed a bitter paradox. The same substance, but two fates. In Beverly Hills, cocaine was a fashion statement, a symbol of privilege. In South Bronx, crack cocaine was a death sentence for an entire generation. Millions were imprisoned, thousands of families shattered, and slums drowned in despair, while the cartels of the South grew richer, stronger, and more untouchable than ever. The press called it the decade of cocaine, and indeed, no corner of American pop culture remained untouched. Films like Scarface 1983 and Miami Vice did not merely reflect reality, they turned cocaine into a cinematic icon. Desire, power, and guilt. Three forces intertwined into an intoxicating spell the world couldn't look away from. Cocaine had become a new religion, one in which believers were willing to trade everything. Careers, reputations, even their souls. America in the 1980s lived fast, spent fast, and burned out just as fast. Behind every neon light was a broken life. Behind every white line, a body, lying somewhere in South America or in a dark New York alley. The irony was that American media, while condemning drugs, unintentionally glorified them. Newspapers plastered drug lords on their front pages. Hollywood turned them into anti-heroes. The world watched, fascinated, even admiring those who defied the system with money and violence. And in that fascination, cocaine kept spreading, a cultural virus that could not be erased. The 1980s ended, leaving behind a spiritually fractured America. The government claimed gradual victories, but everyone knew those were words to soothe the public. The cartels remained powerful, the smuggling routes alive, and cocaine still pulsed silently through the veins of a nation addicted to its own illusions. Looking back, the 1980s were not merely a time of drugs. They were a time when humanity blurred the line between reality and fantasy. Cocaine was no longer just a narcotic, it was the metaphor for our endless hunger, for success, for pleasure, for more. A society that lived too fast, desired too much, and was finally consumed by its own craving. And when the fever faded, when those once on top of the world quietly fell into ruin, America was forced to confront the truth. No substance could ever erase loneliness. No white powder could ever replace faith, love, or inner balance. But history did not stop there. The remnants of the 1980s, the cartels, the smuggling routes, the addicts, would evolve, adapt, and find new forms in the 21st century. And the world, though it had learned so many bloody lessons, still had not truly awakened from its long dream called cocaine. When the cocaine fever of the 1980s finally faded, America believed it had won. Colombian kingpins like Pablo Escobar were hunted down, the Medellin empire crumbled, the Cali cartel fell apart. The newspapers triumphantly declared, "The war on drugs is over." But they didn't realize that while the camera lights still gleamed over the corpses of the Colombian lords, across the border, in the dry, sun-scorched land of Mexico, a new force was quietly rising. It was not flamboyant or ostentatious like Medellin. It was more dangerous, more brutal, and above all, more intelligent. This was the dawn of the narco state era, when crime no longer merely trafficked drugs, but seized entire nations. After Colombia turned into a battlefield, Mexican cartels swiftly took over the role of middlemen in the cocaine trade to the US. At first, they were only couriers, transporting shipments from South America to the northern border. But money, power, and blood changed everything. Gradually, these intermediaries refused to remain in the shadows. They wanted control of production, distribution, and laundering alike. And like predators scenting fresh blood, Mexico transformed itself into the new heart of the underworld. That was when the Sinaloa cartel rose, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. He was not a flashy king like Escobar, but a man who lived in the shadows, shrewd, ruthless, and never where the light could find him. While Escobar challenged the Colombian state with bombs and guns, El Chapo conquered Mexico's system with money and fear. Politicians, police, soldiers, all could be bought or silenced. Mexico slowly became a two-layered country where the legal government was but a thin mask covering the true power of the cartels. The 1990s and early 2000s witnessed the expansion of Mexico's drug networks to an unprecedented scale. Cartels like Tijuana, Juarez, Gulf, and Zetas divided the land among themselves, controlling every road, every port, every stretch of the border. Each shipment of cocaine from South America traveled through jungles, deserts, and even underground tunnels, artificial arteries binding two nations together. Mexico, once known for tequila and mariachi, earned a chilling new name, Narco State. In this narco state, the law existed only on paper. True authority lay with those who held guns and dollars. Tens of thousands were killed every year in purges. Mayors, journalists, and judges were assassinated in broad daylight. Ordinary people lived under a constant shadow of fear, never knowing if they would make it home the next day. Yet what was most horrifying was how these cartels legitimized their power. They didn't just sell drugs. They built schools, hospitals, churches, and provided jobs for the poor. In regions abandoned by the state, cartels became the second government, protecting, feeding, and ruling in exchange for absolute loyalty. To many, the cartel was not the villain, it was the savior. And that was the true tragedy, when the line between good and evil disappeared. The northern regions of Mexico became battlefields. The government's war on drugs, launched in 2006 under President Felipe Calderón, was meant to cleanse the nation of crime. Instead, it poured fuel on the fire. Hundreds of thousands of troops were deployed. Yet every bullet fired ignited another vendetta. Bodies were hung from bridges, buried in mass graves, and posted online as warnings. The press called it the Hell of Mexico. The world shuddered. But worse still, the cartels began expanding beyond drugs into human trafficking, extortion, arms dealing, oil theft, and even politics. In many areas, cartels interfered with elections, installing their own mayors, even congressmen. The drug lords no longer just carried guns, they carried political power. Meanwhile, across the border, America, the nation that had waged war on drugs for half a century, remained its biggest customer. Billions of US dollars flowed each year from American consumers into the hands of Mexican cartels, and that very money fueled the entire machinery of crime. A cruel paradox. America's war on drugs was, in truth, feeding the enemy it sought to destroy. In that endless cycle, it was the Mexican people who suffered the most. Rural lands were abandoned. Young men without jobs joined cartels to survive. A whole generation grew up to the sound of gunfire, in fear, within a culture already narcoticized. The narco corridos, ballads glorifying drug lords as folk heroes, spread everywhere, a distorted echo of national pride. The Mexican underworld functioned like a vast machine. At the top were the bosses. In the middle, international finance networks, washing the blood from their money, and at the bottom, millions of anonymous lives. The Coca farmers, the couriers, the teenage gunmen who never knew what childhood meant. They were all gears in that machine, one greased with blood, tears, and US dollars. And yet amid all this chaos, there was something strange. The world seemed to accept Mexico's existence as a narco state. For drugs were no longer Mexico's or South America's story alone. They had become a global system, tied to Swiss banks, Dutch ports, Italian mafias, and American consumers. The line between legal and illegal, between nation and crime, had blurred beyond recognition. Thus, the narco state was not merely a Mexican phenomenon. It was the mirror of our modern world, where money can buy everything, even justice itself. And Mexico, with its blood-soaked soil, its towns reduced to ashes and orphans, stands as a haunting warning to all humanity. When greed becomes legitimate, an entire nation can become hostage to evil. In the 2010s, when El Chapo was captured, escaped, and captured again, the world watched as if it were a blockbuster movie. But few remembered the hundreds of thousands who had died behind the spectacle. The narco state was not just a headline, it was a living nightmare. It existed in the daily fear of citizens, in the eyes of Mexican children born under the sound of gunfire. And like a chilling new chapter in the long history of cocaine, the age of the narco state reminds us of one thing. When evil no longer hides in the shadows, when it wears a suit, holds a microphone, and smiles for the cameras. The world has truly reached the fragile line between civilization and collapse. When the fields of Mexico were stained red and the cartels began to infiltrate the very machinery of government, the world thought the nightmare would remain confined to the Americas. But evil, like water, always finds a new path to flow. As pressure from the United States and the Mexican government made traditional smuggling routes too dangerous, the smarter traffickers began seeking new lands, places where laws were weak, people were poor, and borders stretched endlessly. And so, cocaine entered a new, darker chapter of its journey. From the Americas, it spread to Europe and Africa, weaving an intricate global network so vast that no nation could truly stand apart. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Europe was entering an age of deep integration. The Schengen borders opened, trade flourished, and freedom of movement became a symbol of unity. Yet, within that same tide of openness, the containers of global commerce began carrying a different kind of cargo: cocaine. Major seaports like Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Antwerp in Belgium, and Gioia Tauro in Italy became gateways for the white powder to flood into the old continent. And the ones controlling it were none other than Europe's own mafia, especially the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian crime syndicate rooted in southern Italy. If South American cartels ruled with guns, the 'Ndrangheta ruled with silence, strategy, and financial power. They did not fire bullets, They bought people. They did not challenge governments. They infiltrated economies, working hand in hand with South American suppliers. They turned the ports into trade laboratories, where hundreds of tons of cocaine were hidden inside shipments of bananas, timber, and even humanitarian aid. Cocaine was no longer a contraband product. It had become a component of global commerce itself. From the ports, it trickled into the nightclubs of Paris, London, and Berlin, into the elegant old quarters of Madrid and Milan. Europe, proud of its order and civility, had quietly become the world's second largest consumer, just after the United States. Yet unlike the loud panic of America in the 1980s, Europe preferred silence. People no longer spoke of cocaine as a scourge, but as a private indulgence, something that coexisted with fine wine and techno music. Even more dangerously, Europe's wealth and stability made it the perfect paradise for money laundering. Billions of euros from drug trafficking were legalized through banks, real estate, and even art. Many corporations had no idea, or perhaps did not want to know, that they were enabling the global drug machine. The underworld and the legal world began to merge, their boundaries fading. And that quiet convergence made Europe the perfect breeding ground for cocaine to thrive. But while Europe became a luxury market, Africa turned into the new transit hub, a living chessboard for organized crime. From the mid-2000s onward, trafficking routes shifted. Instead of moving directly to the US, smugglers began crossing the Atlantic and landing in Guinea-Bissau, Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, nations poor in resources, weak in governance, but rich in coastline and corruption. In Guinea-Bissau, a small nation with barely any navy, cocaine took control of politics within just a few years. Generals, ministers, even presidents were accused of collusion. The world gave it a chillingly accurate nickname, Africa's narco state. Yet the horror lay not only in corruption, but in transformation. Cocaine didn't just pass through Africa, it stayed. Some shipments were kept as payment for local gangs, and soon the powder found its way into the slums of Lagos, Dakar, and Abidjan. Addiction began to spread. Young men, trapped in poverty, were lured into trafficking networks. What was once a stopover turned into a new consumer market, beginning a fresh cycle of destruction. African drug crime had none of Hollywood's glamour. It unfolded quietly, in seaside villages, where locals were paid a few $100s to store a crate, never realizing it could destroy their entire nation. And by the time international authorities discovered the truth, the system was already bought and sealed. The spread of cocaine into Europe and Africa revealed a brutal truth. Drugs are no longer born of one land. They are a product of globalization. They move with trade, flow with money, and slip through the cracks of law. Every time one border closes, 10 more open. And in this interconnected world, no one is truly innocent. A man in London snorting a line at a party indirectly fuels violence in Colombia. A bank in Switzerland turning a blind eye to a suspicious account legitimizes blood money from Africa. The world today is bound not only by the internet, but by invisible threads of crime. Global agencies have tried for decades to break these networks. Interpol, Europol, the United Nations all launched campaigns. Yet cocaine keeps flowing, like an endless river, because the root of the problem does not lie in borders. It lies in human nature, greed, fear, and the hunger for control. Just as centuries ago, the Inca chewed coca leaves to draw strength from the sun god, humankind today still seeks a kind of divine power, only now that God is named prophet and dominance. Cocaine, once a sacred gift of light, has become the universal language of global crime, spoken in dollars, euros, and blood. And so, the journey of cocaine does not end in the Andes, nor in Medellin, nor Mexico. It drifts across oceans, seeps into the veins of the modern world. In Europe, it hides within champagne glasses of the elite. In Africa, it mixes with the mud on cargo boats bound for distant shores. This story is not merely about drugs. It is about the spread of darkness in a world that calls itself civilized, a world where sacred values are traded for profit. And in this current, cocaine is no longer a stimulant. It is a symbol of an age where crime wears the mask of commerce, and ambition dresses itself as civilization. But the tragedy does not end there. While Europe and Africa remain shrouded in the white haze, another shadow has begun to rise. A deadlier, cheaper, and faster killer. Born not from mountains, but from laboratories. Fentanyl, the final chapter in the saga of the white powder, where death no longer comes from the Andes, but from the very hands of humankind. When the world believed it had understood the white powder, that cocaine was the ultimate summit of crime and temptation, from the shadows, a new monster quietly appeared. There were no Coca fields, no guns, no cartels to hold borders. Only a small laboratory and a few grams of chemicals were needed. From the deep channels of the global supply chain, fentanyl, a synthetic drug dozens of times stronger than heroin, was born, opening a new tragic era of the 21st century. If cocaine symbolized glamour, lavish years and power, fentanyl became the face of despair. It no longer belonged to the elite at glittering parties. It crept into every poor corner and dark street of the United States, Canada, and now the world. A single microscopic dose, a tiny speck of that white powder, can stop a heart in less than a minute. Fentanyl does more than kill people. It can erase a whole generation. The story did not begin with criminals so much as with faith in modern medicine. At the end of the 20th century, American pharmaceutical corporations, notably Purdue Pharma, the company behind OxyContin, launched a revolution in pain treatment. They promoted opioid medications as a medical miracle, safe and non-addictive. Doctors were encouraged to prescribe them. Patients trusted and used them. Gradually, America sank into a legalized intoxication. But as every miracle in the history of the white powder shows, anything praised to excess contains the seeds of destruction. Millions of Americans became dependent on opioids. When prescription drugs were restricted, many turned to heroin, cheaper and easier to obtain. And when heroin grew scarce, fentanyl appeared as a ruthless solution, stronger, cheaper and simpler to produce. Unlike cocaine or heroin, which require fields and crops, fentanyl is the child of chemistry. It can be synthesized anywhere, in legitimate labs in China or India, or in makeshift clandestine workshops in Mexico. 1 kilogram of fentanyl can produce millions of doses, enough to kill an entire city. That is why it has become the most lucrative item in the history of narcotics. Mexico's cartels, seasoned by decades of cocaine trafficking, quickly seized the opportunity. No longer needing to ship hundreds of tons across borders, now a few kilos of fentanyl suffice. Deadly laboratories sprang up across Sinaloa, Tijuana, and Michoacan. The synthetic white powder was mixed into heroin, painkillers, even sleeping pills, so thousands of users did not know what they were taking. By the time they discovered the truth, it was already too late. In the United States, more than 100,000 people die each year from overdoses, nearly 70% of those deaths involving fentanyl. These numbers are no longer statistics. They are real tragedies spreading from small towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania to major cities like Los Angeles and New York. In many communities, fentanyl has claimed an entire generation of young people, not hardened criminals or traditional addicts, but ordinary souls who sought relief from pain. Perhaps the most frightening aspect of fentanyl is not just its speed of death, but its silence. There are no famous cartels like Escobar's, no bloody shootouts on city streets, only bodies found quietly in bathrooms beside a pill that seemed harmless. Fentanyl does not need violence to spread death. It does so with quietude. This silence took the world by surprise. While governments were busy fighting cocaine and methamphetamine, fentanyl quietly dominated the global drug market. In a single decade, it became the primary cause of the public health crisis in North America, spread into Europe, and began appearing in Asia. In the age of globalization, fentanyl does not travel by container ships or border convoys alone. It moves through the internet. Dark web markets, hidden forums, and encrypted apps have made buying drugs easier than ever. With a few clicks, a package of fentanyl can be delivered to a doorstep, disguised as pain relief, chemical powder, or research chemicals. What deepens this tragedy is the invisibility of the perpetrators. There are no clear lords to hunt, no single cartel to dismantle. Instead, a diffuse global network exists, where each manufacturer, each seller, and each buyer convinces themselves they are merely one small link, not responsible for the whole. But the final toll remains the same. Hundreds of thousands of lives taken, a generation erased. If cocaine once mirrored the ambition to rise, fentanyl now reflects the emptiness of the modern age, a wealthy, comfortable world that is nonetheless profoundly lonely. where people carry voids in their hearts that no technology can fill. Fentanyl becomes a false friend, soothing pain briefly while taking everything forever. Behind the numbers dwell stories that are never fully told. A mother collapsed beside her 19-year-old son's body, a veteran who cannot escape physical pain, a college student trying a stress pill once and never waking again. These tragedies no longer hide in darkness. They occur in the most ordinary lives, among people who seemed at peace. Governments have tried to respond, but fentanyl is not an enemy that can be defeated with guns or bans alone. It is more than a drug problem. It is a crack in the soul of modern society. When people lose faith, when communities break down, when loneliness and pressure become the norm, even if fentanyl were eradicated, another drug would emerge, shaped differently, but serving the same purpose: to fill the gap we refuse to face. Perhaps the tragedy of the 21st century is not simply fentanyl itself, but that, despite witnessing millions of deaths, we still have not learned how to truly live. Looking back along the long path from the ancient coca leaf in the Andes to the white powder in today's syringes, we see that narcotics have never been merely substances. They are mirrors reflecting the human soul. From curiosity to ambition to despair, each phase of the drug story tells us something about ourselves. And fentanyl, with all its cruelty, states the clearest truth. Humans may conquer the world, but they still cannot conquer themselves. Perhaps the deepest tragedy of our age is not fentanyl, but that after so many deaths, we remain unable to learn the art of living. As this journey comes to an end, we realize that the story of cocaine is not merely the history of a white powder, but a mirror reflecting humanity's greed, fear, and longing. From the sacred coca leaves of the Andes to the cold laboratories where fentanyl was born, every chapter tells the same tale. Humankind has always yearned to surpass its own limits, yet the further we go, the more lost we become. The world has changed, but the addiction to power, fame, and forgetfulness still lives on in every age. And perhaps it is in the very moment we believe we are in control that the white powder begins to control us. If you wish to delve deeper into the hidden shadows of history, where faith, sin, and ambition intertwine like a half-forgotten dream, then stay with us through the nights to come. For every story we tell is not only meant to lull you to sleep, but to awaken within you the truth of humanity, the truth about ourselves.